Hello everyone and welcome to episode 7 of my Black Plague painting series. This time I'm going to be painting Blackheart from the special guest box by Stefan Kopinski. I'm going to start off in the usual way by first washing and priming the miniature. And this time I'm going to be using Army Painter's Uniform Grey matte primer. The first color I'm going to be using is a 50-50 mix of Army Painter's Alien Purple and Citadel's Naggoroth Night. Blackheart is wearing a sash under his other accessories, and since this is the hardest place to reach, I'm going to paint that first. For the inner robe, I'm going to be using Citadel's Mournfang Brown. For the hands and face, I'm going to be using Army Painter's Tanned Flesh. I've thinned my paint down quite a bit for this, just to make sure the paint gets into all the deep creases in Blackheart's face. If you don't have tanned flesh, Bugman's Glow is a Citadel equivalent. For all the leather accessories on Blackheart's chest, I'm going to be using a 2-to-1 mix of Mournfang Brown and Mephiston Red. Gold ornament and the buckles on Blackheart's chest, I'm going to be using Valejo's Glorious Gold. Next I'm going to be painting the hair or the fur that's running down Blackheart's back. And for this I'm going to be doing all the highlighting and shading at once. I'm going to start off by covering the entire thing with a layer of Steel Legion Drab. Once that's done, I'm going to mix in an equal amount of Karak Stone. Next, I'm going to repaint about 90% of the hair, leaving only the deepest recesses. Once that's done, I'm going to move on to some pure Karak Stone, and with this, I'm going to paint about the top 50% of the hair and the top of the shoulders. And finally, I'm going to switch to some pure Ushabti Bone, and I'm just going to highlight the tops of the shoulders once again, and the top 10% of the hair around the base of his neck. For the last step, I'm going to use some watered down Agrax Earthshade, and I'm going to blend all these colors together. You may need to add 2 to 3 layers of this just to get a smooth transition between the different shades. For Blackheart's robes, I've decided to start with a 50-50 mix of Calgar Blue and Kantor Blue. I'm starting off with a large brush for the large areas of the robe, and then I'm going to switch to successively smaller brushes to cover the smaller areas. Next, I'm going to be using Citadel's Screaming Skull to paint all the bone accessories. There's a small skull hanging from his left hip, but I'm going to ignore that for now. I'm also going to be using the Screaming Skull to paint the antlers on Blackheart's headdress. I had already moved on to the next color when I realized that I forgot to paint the bones on his chest. Next, I'm going to mix in an equal amount of Ceremite White and paint the skull on his left hip. I'm going to use this same color to paint the rest of the bone on Blackheart's headdress. It's difficult to see, but there's also 2 bones that hang down on the side of Blackheart's face. Next, I'm going to paint the feathers on the headdress using Army Painter's Brainmatter Beige. The details on the feathers are quite minute, so once again I'm going to thin down my paints so they don't conceal those details. For all the leather straps around Blackheart's waist, I'm going to be using Army Painter's Leather Brown. There are also some very narrow straps that are holding the bones onto his chest. And finally, I'm going to use the leather brown to paint the hilt of his scythe. Next, I'm going to be using Army Painter's Gunmetal to paint the final ornament hanging from Blackheart's belt. For the frame of the hourglass, I've decided to use Army Painter's Dirt Spatter. Something I didn't notice until later was that part of the hourglass's frame is tucked in very close to the cloak. I'm next going to use the dirt spatter to paint the staff. finally I'm going to paint Blackheart's shoes using the same color. For the blade of the scythe, I want to start off with a dark metallic color, so I'm going to be using P3's Pig Iron. If you don't have this, you could just mix a little black into any of your other silver colors. Next, I'm going to be painting Blackheart's wraps, and for this I'm going to be using Citadel's Karak Stone. I decided I wanted to give a little more detail to the feathers on the headdress and the staff, so I'm going to be painting the tips of them with a mixture of Abaddon Black and Mechanicus Standard Grey. Next I'm going to move on to highlighting and shading, and I'm going to shade most of the miniature using Agrax Earthshade. I'm first going to be using this on his inner robe and everything hanging from his chest. Once that's done, I'm still using the Agrax Earthshade, this time on the staff. I'm also going to use the Earthshade on Blackheart's wraps, along with the top part of his headdress, excluding the feathers. Finally, we can use the Earthshade on the handle of the scythe. For the feathers on the headdress, I'm going to be using a 3-to-1 mix of water and Nuln Oil. Once I've gotten the white part of the feathers to a point where I like them, I'm then going to use pure Nuln Oil and then darken the tips of the feathers. Next, I'm going to do the highlighting and shading of the face. I'm doing things a bit backwards from what I've done in previous videos. That's because I want to use the wash last to give him a bit of a grimy look at the end. So I'm starting off with Army Painter's Barbarian Flesh, and I'm going to paint the majority of his face, but avoiding those really deep creases. I'm also going to paint the top 75% of his arms. Next, I'm going to add a few highlights. I'm just going to be painting the tip of his nose, his chin, and his cheekbones. For this, I'm going to be using Citadel's Kislev Flesh. I'm also going to be using this to paint the most upturned surface of his arms. Now I'm going to smooth all those colors together using a 2-to-1 mix of Reikland Fleshshade and Agrax Earthshade. Once the wash had dried, I added 2 more layers to the inside of his mouth to darken it. I'm using the same mix to shade the hands and the arms. For the highlights on the inner robe, I'm going to start with a reapplication of Mournfang Brown. I'm going to cover most of the robe this way, except for the deep folds. For For the next layer, I'm going to have an equal mix of Mournfang Brown and XV88. I'm also mixing this with a generous amount of water, although you could also use Lamian Medium. When you first apply the XV88, it looks really light. Just give it some time to dry and it darkens quite a bit. So I'm going to apply this to the top 60% of the robe, and once it dries, I'm going to apply another layer that's even smaller. For the final layers, I'm going to be using a 2-to-1 mix of XV88 and Mournfang Brown. The back of the robe is a bit of a challenge to highlight, but I'm going to start off with a 1-to-1 mix of Calgar Blue and Kantor Blue, and then I'm going to lighten it slightly with more Calgar Blue. And since there aren't a lot of deep folds in this robe, I'm just going to start about halfway up, and I'm going to lighten the robe as it gets further down towards the ground. I'm going to paint most of the arm with this, but I'm going to leave the creases and the underside of the sleeves untouched. Next, I'm going to mix in more Calgar Blue until I have a roughly 2-to-1 mix of Calgar Blue to Kantor Blue. And now I'm going to repeat the process I just did, but this time I'm going to start further down on the robe. I'm going to focus mostly on the lower portion of the robe and the tops of the folds. I'm going to paint the same places on the sleeves, but this time I'm going to narrow the area that I'm actually painting. For the final layer, I'm just going to use some pure Calgar Blue. I'm going to focus most of this near the tops of the sleeves, the most raised parts of the folds, and just around the edges of the robe. As a final step, I'm making a 5-to-1 mix of Drakenhof Nightshade and water. I'm just going to use this to smooth the transition between my layer colors and to deepen the color within the folds. For the first highlight on the wraps, I'm just going to reapply Karak Stone. After that, I'm going to mix in an equal amount of Screaming Skull, and I'm just going to highlight the top part of the wraps. For the antlers and bones, I'm just going to reapply some watered down Screaming Skull, and I'm only using this on the upward facing surfaces of the bones. Next, I'm going to take my Screaming Skull and mix in an equal amount of Ceremite White. I'm first going to use this for the skull hanging at his belt, and then I'm going to use it to highlight around the edges of the bone part of his headdress. I'm also using this to highlight the sharp tips of the antlers. Next, I'm going to do the gemstone in the staff. I'm going to start off by painting the stone both front and back with Stormhost Silver. Once that's completely dried, I'm then going to apply a layer of Waystone Green. Next, I'm just going to retouch some of the gold areas using the Glorious Gold. For the buckle and the chest ornament, I'm basically just tracing around the edges to make them stand out. There's also a small gold ring that all the leather straps are attached to at his waist. As for the small square at the center of his chest, I'm going to be covering this completely with fresh gold paint, and then hitting it with some Spiritstone Red to give it the appearance of a red gemstone. For the leather accessories hanging below his waist, I'm going to be using a mix of 2 parts Mournfang Brown, 1 part Mephiston Red, and 1 part Wild Rider Red. I'm first going to use this to paint the tops of all the leather accessories, and then I'm going to use it to paint the raised stitching along his armor. Once that's done, I'll mix in a generous amount of XV88, and I'll paint the raised stitching one more time. Next, I'm going to move on to the scythe, and I'm going to start by using Army Painter's plate mail metal to paint the top sides of the curved blade. I've thinned this paint down a bit just so I can create a gradual change in the brightness of the metal. Once that's done, I'm then going to use Nuln Oil to shade the underside of the curve. And just like with the metallic paint, I'll be applying this in multiple layers. You'll notice that my brush strokes are always moving towards the area that I want to become the darkest. The last step I'm going to do for the blade is to use some Stormhost Silver just to pick out the very edge of the blade. I'm also going to use the Stormhost Silver to pick out some of the square edges around the handle. Next, I'm going to use Army Painter's Dead Black to paint the inside of the hourglass. I'm going to try to create the appearance of sand being in the lower half, so I'm going to be using a 5:1 mix of water and Mephiston Red. I'm just going to dab small amounts onto the bottom half of the hourglass until I get a nice deep red color. Next, I'm going to draw a thin line across the top of the sand using Wild Rider Red. Once that's done, I'm going to use some dirt spatter and touch up the frame of the hourglass. Now I'm going to mix in an equal amount of leather brown, and I'm going to use this to highlight the staff. I'm going to focus my paint on the top of the staff and all the raised ridges along its length. character art for Blackheart, it shows him having beady eyes. I like the idea of all the necromancers having all white eyes, so for this part I'm using Citadel's Ceremite White. To paint the base, I'm using my usual mix of 2:1 Karak Stone and Steel Legion Drab. Next, I'm going to use Skaven Blight Dinge to paint a flagstone pattern. Once that's done, I'm going to use a combination of Screaming Skull and Brainmatter Beige to color in random stones. And finally, I'm going to paint all around the rim of the base using Citadel's Dryad Bark. One final step I do with all my miniatures is to coat the base with Army Painter's Quickshade. This is just so I can maintain the same color scheme for all my bases in Black Plague. After waiting 24 hours for the Quickshade to dry, it's time to spray the whole miniature with some matte varnish. The final step for this miniature is to apply some Ardcoat onto the hourglass and the gemstones. And here's our finished product. I hope you enjoyed this video, and there are plenty more to come. Thank you very much for watching.